Hi, welcome to the Behind the Balance Sheet podcast, where we meet leading investors and commentators and educate ourselves about the world of investing and the world. Our mission is to remove some of the mystique around investing and improve our understanding of what makes a successful investment, or indeed an unsuccessful one. Our goal is to inform, educate, and entertain. We hope you enjoy this and every episode.
Behind the Balance Sheet and affiliates and podcast guests may own shares or have an economic interest in securities discussed in this podcast, which is aired for your education and entertainment only. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as investment advice or relied upon for investment decisions. Always do your own research.
Vitaliy Katsenelson is a Russian-born investor and writer. In this fascinating and wide-ranging discussion, we talk about wealth preservation in the 2020s, why it will be different from previous decades, and why he thinks stock picking will be key to preserving wealth. We discuss how in turbulent markets, Vitaliy dampens the volatility of his clients' blood pressure by regular and clear communication, how he doesn't look for clients but allows them to find him because he thinks having the right clients is key to success in any investment firm. And we talk about his life philosophy, as set out in his latest book, Soul in the Game. We also talk about why scarcity is the key to a happy and fulfilled life, and you will learn what I have in common with General Stanley McChrystal. Vitaliy's life philosophy reveals a wisdom beyond his years, and his positive attitude can improve anyone's life. We spend less time in investing than in some previous episodes, but it was really enjoyable. And my friends at Harriman House are offering 30% off Vitaliy's book and my book, The Smart Money Method, until 31st December. Visit their website and use the code BTBS30. Vitaliy, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So look, let's start by talking about how you got into investing, because that's how we always start. And it's very interesting. So many of the guests, their entry into investing was completely serendipitous. Tell us about how you ended up the boss of IMA.
I guess I would argue I had the same kind of experience. It was serendipity and luck. So I was born in Russia, and I moved to the United States in 1991. I was 18 years old, and I had no idea what I wanted to do when I kind of grow up. So I went to college, and in college, I tried 6 or 7 different majors and couldn't really find the one I liked. And then I got a job at an investment firm, and they hired me because of my computer skills. And at the same time, I was taking a finance class. And this kind of serendipity between me taking a finance class and work investment firm, I started to discuss what I learned at school, at work, and started to have a lot of interesting conversations with portfolio managers. This is where I realized, oh my God, actually, this is something very interesting to me. And at that point, it's like this, I had this aha moment, like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And I changed my major for the last time to finance, got my undergraduate degree in finance, graduate degree in finance, CFA, and basically kind of focused on being in this, kind of doing investing for the rest of my life. Now, I got this job. This is kind of interesting story. So the firm I worked for before, they did not need another analyst. So I had to look for another place to work. And so this is 1987. I want you to remember, this is before the internet, kind of. Like, the internet was there, but not really. So I literally opened Yellow Pages. Yeah, that was the time of Yellow Pages. And faxed my resume to every single firm in Denver. Like, it took me, 3 or 4 days to do this. But I kind of just send one fax at a time. And this firm, the analyst who was working here before me, she left. And they did not even post a job online yet. Or on the newspaper. So I was competing against nobody, because as I've been told after the fact, I was the only person who was interviewed for this job. And so I do very well in competitions when I compete against nobody. So I won. And that's how I got the job. So this was 1987. Today's 2022. So that was 25 years ago. So I started here as an analyst, then over time transitioned to portfolio manager, then CIO, and now I'm a CEO and owner of IMA.
Fantastic. And you're I mean, it's a big firm, right? You've got several $100 million in
Well,
management.
big as we managed about $350 million. So big as the relative world, but world in this universe. But we are a good firm. I don't look at how big we are. I look how good we are, and I would argue we are a good firm. So that's more important to me than the size.
Well, I'm sure you are. But I was fascinated to read in your book, which we'll come to later, that you aren't even in the top 20 in Denver. I mean, that seems extraordinary. You've got that size.
We may actually. It's to be honest, I'm not even sure anymore. We may be, but I stopped looking.
All right. But this is a difficult business, isn't it? Because I did a spell where I used to advise a large wealth manager in the UK, and I used to help them pick international equities because they had a lot of experience in the UK, but they wanted to go more overseas. And I then started running or helping them run some money. So it was technically run by somebody else, but I picked the stocks. And it was really difficult because everybody had a different portfolio. And so when you're successful, more people want to give you money, but the stocks that you picked for the first people aren't necessarily the stocks you pick for the next. Do you have a model portfolio that everybody follows? How does it work?
You're asking a good question. So what we do, every portfolio is customized for the client. But when I say this, it sounds a little bit, I'm overstating the case a little bit. So let me kind of peel the layers of that. Okay. So when a person comes to us, we ask him, would you like to be? We have two products, two strategies. We have a dividend. We have a kind of our active value strategy, which is kind of traditional value strategy, active value strategy, and then we have a dividend strategy, which is a similar strategy to the first one, except now we also want to buy stocks that pay significant dividend. Okay. So once people they make this choice, they also tell us about if they have any kind of restrictions, like meaning some people don't want to own I don't know, like tobacco stocks or energy stocks. So they have this kind of restrictions. And then finally, when we buy stocks for them, we only buy stocks that are still undervalued. So this is an important point. This is where customization happens. A lot of customization happens. Let's say we bought a stock which we think is worth $100. And 6 months ago, we bought it when it was at $40. And let's say now it's at $80. So if the stock has doubled, and it's still not at the fair value, so if we're still holding it, we might have reduced the position a little bit. Okay, so when the new account comes in, we would not buy that stock for new client, and we would buy some other stocks. So a lot of times, what would happen? New clients' portfolios would look different from the accounts that just started with us. Let's say you have two clients without any restrictions in the same strategy, but they come to us even 2 weeks apart or 6 months apart. All their portfolios will look different, and the amount of cash. This is a very important point. The amount of cash they have will be different as well. Over time, these portfolios will look similar, more and more similar over time. But in the beginning, they're going to look very different. And this is actually, this has helped us tremendously over the last 6 months because we would not buy into stocks that were fairly, kind of undervalued, but not as undervalued. And so now we can buy them a lot cheaper. So, yes.
Can you talk a little bit, because I mean, 60-40 has been the sort of staple diet for wealth managers here, RIAs in the US, and it isn't going to work any longer. I mean, it's not been working this year, obviously, and it seems unlikely that it will work for several years. Well, what's your view on that?
I think it was a kind of a mindless strategy from the 90s. And what I mean by this, because when you had a normal environment where the bond market was kind of when the interest rates were more or less at free market rates, then the strategy worked fine, right? Because the bonds at the time provided, I don't know, the inflation plus 3% or something. Well, the interest rates, and also the strategy had worked well because interest rates have been declining for the last 30 years. Now, I think the environment we are facing in today is that the interest rates may not be declining for a long time. I mean, I'm not talking about next 6 months, but I'm talking about long term. And therefore, you mindlessly buying bonds because you used to buy, because you're supposed, you're this age and this age, you're supposed to be at this strategy. I think it's very dangerous. And I would argue that there will be time to own bonds, but I don't think this is the time right now. Again, like, the rates may decline in the next 6 months from this point on. I have no idea what they're going to do, but I would argue that if you did this, if you basically, by the way, I would have told you the same thing if you and I talked a year ago.
Yeah, sure.
So if you follow the strategy, I think it's probably not going to work well for some time. At some point, there will be time for it again.
What's the alternative? Are you 100% equities or just more than 60? I mean,
I hate to be when I answer this question, I feel this guilt because I don't have a good answer. Like, really don't. Because the answer I have is very inefficient answer. And the answer is basically you have a barbell strategy. You basically want to have your enough savings. Let's say if you are in your 60s, or you want to have enough cash that for next 5 years, and you put this cash into something, I don't know, like 6 months to 1 year treasuries, something riskless, basically.
Yeah.
It's not going to keep up with today's inflation, don't get me wrong, but it's going to pay your bills and you won't have to rely on the whims in the stock market. And then what that does, it buys you time horizon to invest in a kind of undervalued individual stocks. But it's not the most efficient portfolio, right? Because when you buy 6 months or 1 year bonds, you are getting 3.5% returns when inflation is much higher than that.
Yeah,
that portion of your money is there just to buy you peace of mind. So when stocks go up and down, you are not forced to sell stocks when they're low, so you can pay for your daughter's wedding or whatever.
No, absolutely, and the daughters' weddings can be very expensive. I know that. And you espouse individual stocks. I mean, a lot of RIAs in the US favor ETFs, and they favor like an index strategy, and maybe add in a factor ETF, a momentum ETF, or whatever. I had on the podcast 2 months ago a guy called Richard Oldfield, who's a very skilled investment manager who wrote a book called Simple But Not Easy. And he likened investing in an index to hanging on to the coattails of a lunatic. He said, look, the more the stock goes up, the more you own of it. And that can't be a sensible strategy. And I mean, I completely agree with them that anybody can invest in the stock market. You do need to have a bit of discipline. You do need to understand a little bit about what you're doing, but it's not a complicated thing. It's not easy to manage, but it's fairly simple. I mean, do you use a lot of ETFs? Do you agree with that single stocks are the way to go? And do you think it's possible for individuals to embrace individual stocks? I mean, what's your thinking?
I think it's extremely easy to invest in the stock market. I don't think it's very easy to do it well.
Yeah.
Okay. That's point number one. And I agree that the way the most ETFs are structured is that the most successful the company, the larger the company. Like, think about it. If I apply the strategy in our portfolios, my new clients would basically be buying the largest position that we hold in accounts that came to us, that 6 months ago, or a year ago, 3 years ago. So I would argue that this is not a strategy that actually benefits clients. I think ETFs, I think ETFs are dangerous, could be dangerous, because they look so safe. Because everybody thinks that you're buying a diversified investment, therefore you can blow up on that. Well, you can, because if this investment, if I buy in this investment, you're buying a lot of overvalued companies, then yes, you get you do get diversification on individual company risk, but you aren't diversified against the fact that these companies are all overvalued. Like, if you owned Cathie Wood's ETF, which is down the ARK, I don't know how much it's down now, like down 50, 70, 80% from its high. She owned a lot of stocks in it, but they were all overvalued. So there was no safety in numbers, because when you own a lot of overvalued stocks and market and the valuation of the market declines, you get blown up. I am a believer that in analyzing, the way we approach what we do here, as if we were a business person analyzing each company, if you were buying the whole company. And we ask yourself, do you want to be in this business? Do you like the management who runs the business? And then we ask ourselves, how much is this business worth? And not just the next 6 months, next 5 or 10 years. Okay. And then we say, well, how much discount to what it's worth do we need based on its risk? And that's how we approach building our portfolio for each client.
Yeah, I mean, Kathy Wood's, of course, a classic example. I mean, I don't know I would even classify. I mean, I know technically it's an ETF, but I don't know that I would classify it as an index type ETF, because she owns such a style bias that it's not at all diversified. And of course, she's been the biggest buyer of all of the stocks that she owns. And it might have done, I don't know how much it's down, 70, 80%, but if it doesn't fall another 70 or 80%, I'd be quite surprised, to be honest. But
let me add one more point to this. I think ETFs could be a good tool if used wisely. But what has happened over the last decade, ETFs basically allow any person who used to be an insurance salesman to masquerade as an investment advisor, basically. And that's what they do. And people feel safe, and give people this false safe of security because they feel like they've been diversified. And I would argue, as the tide goes away, we'll find out that a lot of this, people were swimming naked because they owned a lot of overvalued stocks.
Well, I think the issue is, I mean, my perception is that if we look at to 2032 over the next 10 or so years, it's highly unlikely to be like the last 10 years. It's much more likely that in 2032, the market's done very little. I mean, it might go up a bit, but, everybody seems to be assuming that because the market's gone up at 8% for decades, that it'll go up 8% per annum this decade. And that's not what experience tells you, because when you start off from a period of high valuation and you go through a period of, particularly an inflationary period, the stock market may not do anything. And we've seen that in past decades. And, we've all got this we're fixated on our recent experience. And it's also very difficult, I think, to go back in history from before when you were investing. But I've asked a number of people about what it was like to invest in the 1970s. Obviously, I'm too young to remember investing in the 1970s. There are very few people around investing today who were investing in the 1970s. Very few. And people have lost this sort of memory, or they don't have the memory. And of course, what happened in the 1970s was the stock market didn't keep up with inflation overall. And you had to be in a particular type of stock in small cap value in order to beat inflation. And it seems to me, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but that is a very plausible scenario for the next 10 years. I mean, would you disagree with that? Or
it's probably the biggest layup I ever seen to my writing, because I wrote 2 books on this subject, the Little Book of Sideways Markets and Active Value Investing. And both argue the same point we just made. In fact, if you're listening to this, my latest book, my latest investment book, the Little Book of Sideways Markets, came out in 2010, and I would argue that this book is more relevant today, than ever before, because I agree with you 100%. What happens, and you used the right words, you said recency bias. We usually look in the past, and especially if we have a lot of data points, and we draw straight lines through those data points. But the problem is with stock market and the economy, that there are some things that mean reverting. In other words, if they've done incredibly well, a lot of times there will be payback time for those things. One of those things is price to earnings. When price to earnings goes up and it goes from below average to above average, in the future, what happens, price to earnings actually, you borrowed your future returns when price to earnings went to above average.
Yeah.
And then when mean reversion happens, price to earnings goes from above average through average to below average. And what that means, if you think about returns for stocks, I'm excluding dividends, just for simplicity of it, they come from two sources: earnings growth and change in price to earnings. If you look over 100+ year period, the price to earnings movements really kind of canceled out.
Yeah.
And what you got was earnings growth. And in the long run, earnings growth really kind of equated to GDP growth. Okay. So, or economic growth, right? Now, when you enter the market, when the price to earnings at much above average, price to earnings stops being your friend, actually becomes your enemy. Because when it declines, it actually subtracts the return you get from earnings growth. And I would also argue today, it's very likely that the earnings growth for the economy is going to be less than what it was over the last 10 years or last 20 years, especially in the real terms. Because of high inflation, we may still eke out nominal earnings growth, but the real growth will probably going to be either flat or slightly positive, maybe even negative. So yes, I think we are entering a period of sideways markets. And if you just own the market, you're going to get very little. This is why individual stock selection, stock picking becomes so paramount.
You were a bit early with the books.
Yes and no, because I was the active value investing. I started working in this 2005. And I think we were basically in this. Arguably, we were in the sideways markets until about 6-7 years ago, and then as interest rates went to zero and to negative, we broke through we kind of entered into bull market. The issue is, like when I was writing these books, and especially in 2010, I never thought that interest rates could go down can become negative. The concept of negative interest rates was unfathomable to me, because why would you give somebody money and then you agree to get less money at the end of 6 months or a year? This just makes no economic sense, etc. But we were at the negative interest rates for a while, and interest rates were at near zero for a long period of time. So again, that's basically why we went into bull markets.
And it's been a very interesting. It's been a very interesting few years. How do you keep your head when there's sort of madness all around? It must be quite difficult when you're dealing with individuals who've entrusted their wealth to you, and they see their neighbors making out in GameStop or whatever, and you're keeping your feet on the ground and having a rooting in value. How have you coped in the last few years? I mean, have you had pressure from your clients, or do they understand? I mean, how do you explain that to them?
I think a key for investment firm success, any investment firm success in the long run, is having the right clients. And I've been fortunate that the way we market attracts the right clients. And let me explain how we market. It's very simple. There is no mystery here. I write articles. People read these articles. They can relate to how we invest. They come to us. That's it. We don't make cold calls. I don't go to parties in country clubs. I hate, this kind of things. The beauty of this, it's a kind of reverse self-selection. Our clients select us, and therefore they come to us because they want to grow and preserve their wealth. And I guess I would argue our clients probably have a lot less FOMO than, clients of other firms. But that's point number one. Point number two is communication. I mean, let me give you this analogy. I had this client in my office, and we were just chatting, and he used to be a pilot, commercial pilot. And I was telling him how I'm afraid of flying. Let me explain what I mean. I fly all the time. So let me just put it this way. I have a fear of flying, but I fly all the time just because if you just think about, you are, 50,000 feet in the air and this thing can fall anytime. yeah, so I have this kind of a very normal fear of flying. I don't need to get medicated to get on the plane, etc. But I have this slight uneasiness when I fly. That uneasiness becomes less slight when I'm in the air and we go through the turbulence. I become a little bit more religious during that point in time. Again, so there's two sides of it. There is a rational side of me who understands that planes don't crash in the midair. Most accidents happen on the takeoff and landing. I know the statistics. I know all the statistics. That's the rational side of me. The emotional side of me, while in the turbulence, I am scared. So it's because I'm human. Okay. Now, so I was telling him about this, and he said, Vitaliy, it's kind of interesting. When I was flying, when I was in a cockpit, I was never afraid of anything. Now, when I'm a passenger and it goes through the turbulence, yeah, I get a little bit nervous too. And then I realized, this is kind of interesting. When he was in a cockpit, he had control. He had all the information, in front of him. When he's in a cabin, he doesn't have that. He's just another passenger. So realize my job as a money manager is not just being in the cockpit is not good and is not enough. I have to bring my clients as close as possible to cockpit without giving them the control, and communicate to them as clearly as possible what I see and how we are adjusting to the environment we are going into. And so therefore, my job is not really reduce volatility of my client's portfolio, but reduce the volatility of their blood pressure. And so anyway, so that's so you ask me how we get through these times. That's how we get through these times. Right clients and communication. And I would argue sensible strategy.
So you in the book, you talk about a trainer who works 20 hours a week and lives in a small flat. And you talk about your spending habits and how you spend on health, on experience, on experiences, on buying more time for yourself, on education. And you also talk earlier in the book about how somebody explained to you that you needed to have a sinking fund when you needed to replace your car. How do you talk about money to your clients? How do you explain this philosophy, or explain the philosophy to the listeners?
Well, so let's first of all, we have to clarify a little bit. Now we're talking about a different book.
We're talking about
that's fine.
Your new book, which let me just introduce your new book. So your new book is called Soul in the Game, The Art of a Meaningful Life. And it's a brilliant book. And I was telling Vitaliy before we came on that the book is published by Harriman House, and Craig Pierce is his editor, who also was my editor. And I had lunch with Craig, who asked me, well, Steve, what's your second book going to be about? And I said, well, I thought my second book might be not about money and about finance. And he said, oh, no, we would never publish that. But you managed to persuade them to publish your book. And the book is great. And it's probably better than my book will be not about finance. But tell us about your philosophy towards money, because I think this is a really interesting.
First of all, let's make this clear. I spend very little time talking to my clients about personal finance, because that's not what we do. But let me tell you about, in general, my kind of personal finance philosophy. Let's start with this. Money buys the most when it buys things you value.
Yep.
Not every $100 created equal, or every £100 in your case, because £100 that buy things you don't want or don't care about don't buy as much when buy something you care about. So the problem is we go through life, and a lot of times our spending is done in a very mindless way, because it's just one of the things we do, and it's kind of, we get a paycheck and we spend money. What I argue, for money to buy you the most, you need to mindfully approach the subject. How do you do this? You start with budgeting. And budgeting, anybody who's listening, knows the concept. And I'll start with a simple one, but I add some layers on top of that. Simple budgeting, you look how much income you make, and then you look at the expenses that you can see. Your cable bill, your mortgage, your car insurance, all these things you can see, on your credit card bill every month. Now, I would add to it that there's a lot of expenses that you don't see on a monthly credit card bill that happen on a semi-regular basis, just not monthly. And some expenses have not happened yet, but will happen to you. Your daughter will get married, okay, in 10 years. Therefore, you need to pay for that wedding. So you need to start saving money for that now. You're going to need to buy another car in 5 years. Again, that's an expense that's going to happen in 5 years. So you can, if you figure out how much it would cost you a month to save for that, that should go in your budget. And things like that. Okay, by doing this, what you're doing, you're taking future expenses, bringing them into the present. Okay, by the way, your retirement is the same thing. Okay, and the reason we're doing this, because I would argue you want to spend as little money as possible on interest expense, because the power of compounding works both ways. If you're borrowing money, it's actually working against you. So it's obviously fine to borrow money for your mortgage, etc. A reasonable amount of money, but at the same time, you probably don't want to live on credit cards, and you don't want to buy, so why are we talking about this? Because once you created the budget, once you created, create all the lines of your spending, now you ask yourself a question: which item do I value the most? Which item I value the least? This is the key, because you find that you go to Starbucks once a day, and you spend $1,200 a year on the Starbucks, and then ask yourself a question: do I actually enjoy Starbucks this much? Is it do I actually maybe enjoy $200 as much, not $1,200 as much? And because no matter how much money you make, either make $50,000 or $5 million, you can always spend more than you make. Okay, and so what budget is basically prioritizing. God, I can't say the word. Prioritizing tool. Thank you. Prioritizing tool for you to say, I like travel more than I like Starbucks. Yep. Therefore, I'm going to have to give up Starbucks so I can travel more. And that's basically, but by the way, for each one of us is going to be different. Like, I'll give you, for me, and this is a completely personal, and I'm not saying this is what it should be for you or somebody else, but I value travel, experiences. I value health. I value time, and I value education. So when I say this, what does it mean? Well, so in those categories, my budget is much looser. So it's a larger portion of my spending. But now you think, okay, this is the wealthy guy, money manager in Denver. Well, guess what? I live in the same house, we bought 20 years ago. For a long time, I've been driving, same car for, almost 10 years. My wife been driving the same car for 13, 14 years. So for us to travel more, we gave up on a larger house, on new cars. So those are, sacrifices, not a big word, it's kind of is a somewhat overstatement, but those are the things we had to give up, to get other things. Now, like in the book, I talk about my trainer. So my trainer lives in a small apartment, has a roommate. He's divorced, and he's not making a lot of money. And he likes two activities the most. He loves traveling and he likes cars. So every 3 years he leases a new car, and once or twice a month he travels somewhere in the country. But when he travels, he stays in very cheap hotels. He eats out in a very smartly. So he's given up. So he doesn't, when he's in Denver, he doesn't go out much. So he doesn't spend much on food. He also lives in a very modest apartment. But that's what he's given up to travel and to buy a new car, to lease a new car every 3 years.
Because this is, in the United States in particular, it's a society in which everybody seems to be happy to borrow. I mean, it's partly true in this country as well. And people, I don't think, pay sufficient attention to what they really want. That's
So
what you're saying, right?
yeah, no, I mean, like if you think about what money is supposed to do after you paid for your kind of basic needs, it's really just supposed to buy you freedom, like
Yes.
freedom to make choices. What we do by borrowing money excessively, we give up freedom. So this is why, I'm not quite a minimalist. Like in a sense, my house does not look like this Japanese, kind of Japanese minimalistic house, but I get a lot more enjoyment out of relationship and out of experiences than I get from buying things.
I mean, I think most people do. I mean, obviously, people have different priorities when it comes to spending money. But let's just turn to the book and your philosophy of life. I mean, my first question about the book was, you've got the most amazing reviews from the most amazing people: General Stanley McChrystal, Morgan Housel, Bill Miller, Jim Chanos, and Rolf Dobelli, who is one of my heroes. I think he's one of the most brilliant writers. Do you know all these people personally? I mean, how did you manage to do all that?
Okay, so let me put it this way. For me to get these endorsements, I had to have a good book. Like, and this point is very important. So I know some of them. Some of them I know very well. Some of them I know, kind of had a conversation or two in my lifetime. Some of them I've never met. Like, I'll give you one example. General McChrystal, I never met in my life. I heard his interview on Tim Ferriss's podcast.
Which is brilliant. Yeah, it was brilliant.
Yeah, and I really liked him as I could really relate to him as a human being. And I emailed him. I said, "Here's my book. I just finished the book. Here's the manuscript. I would love to get your endorsement." And so he asked, he emailed me back the next day. He said, "What's your deadline?" I said, "I need in 2 weeks." He's like, "I'll read it. However, if I don't like it, I'll tell you. If I don't like it, I'm not going to endorse it. And if I like it, I may endorse it." So that was his response. So this is why having a good book, again, is a prerequisite for that. I got an email back maybe within a week. And he said, "I was on the train, and so I had some extra time. And I read your book and I loved it." And it wasn't just like, it was a very lengthy email, kind of he describing how he relates to it, etc. And he provided this wonderful blurb. That's like, this is a kind of an example of a person I did not know. Some people, like some people I knew much better, or I've met at least. But again, they read the book, and if they did not like the book, they would not have provided the blurb. So,
I'm sure. Look, of course, it's a great book. I mean, but I just
my point is, let me go to the punchline. The punchline is this: if you're creating a product or a service, you need two things. You need a good product and you need luck. And you need to create your luck. So in other words, even if I did not know a lot of people, if I did not know some of the people, I would still have enough blurbs in this book from the people I did not know, because I just reached out to complete strangers, being vulnerable, saying, "Here's what I wrote. Would you look at it?" And that's an act of vulnerability, by the way, because I'm basically, kind of, I could get a no. And by the way, I did get plenty of no's. Like, no's meaning like, "I don't have time for this," kind of thing. I don't think I had a single person who read it and said, "I'm not going to endorse it." Any person who has endorsed it.
Because I'm amazed that somebody like General McChrystal would have time on a 2-week deadline, because I got sent your book, I mean, months ago, and Barbara, your PA, and I put this date in the diary, and I've got a very high reading pile, and it's quite a big book. I didn't want to take it on holiday with me because it's heavy. And so I got back from holiday and I was thinking, oh man, this is a disaster, because I've got this interview and I haven't read the book. And very luckily, last weekend, a friend called me up and he said, "I've got a spare ticket for Goodwood." I don't know if you've heard of Goodwood, but it's the Goodwood Revival meeting is back to the 1960s motor racing festival.
Oh, cool.
where all the cars are old cars. So they race old cars. And it's a great event. And I normally go to a super friend of mine who has become a recluse since COVID and didn't want to go. And so what I did was, instead of driving, because it's a nightmare, because the traffic is horrible, I took the train and I read your book on the train down and on the train back. And I read almost all of it, and it was really, I really enjoyed it, and it, of course, made my journey an awful lot easier.
So you and General McChrystal have something in common. You both read my book on a train.
All right, yeah. Well, that probably is about the only thing I've got in common with him. But I've been trying to persuade my 13-year-old that, because General McChrystal says that the first thing he does in the morning is he makes his bed. And I can't get my 13-year-old to make his bed. Just got no interest in making his bed. And I was hoping that would inspire him, but maybe...
I think, I have a strategy for you. General McChrystal is not the person to use. You got to use Wim Hof, because Wim Hof was one of the endorsers as well. And Wim is for 13-year-old, Wim Hof, who set 25 world records, doing things in a cold temperature. He would be so much more impressive for your 13-year-old, trust me. So the General McChrystal is just a little bit too old for 13-year-old. So I think Wim Hof would be more appropriate.
My son is actually, he's very interested in the military. So I was hoping.
I see.
But I'll try that. I'll try that example. I mean, the funny thing in the book, you talk about a very painful experience about losing your mother at quite a young age, but that bringing you closer to your father. And you obviously have an incredibly close family. Would you mind sharing?
Yeah. So I lost my mother my mom got sick when I was 10, and she died, 5 months later when I was 11 at the time. And at the time I didn't realize it, but losing my mother basically made me value my father so much more, because I realized that at some point I'll lose him too, and that was kind of ingrained into me since very young age. So I always, and just to make it clear, my father made it so easy for me, because he's such a wonderful human being. So even in my 20s, in my 30s, in my 40s, I intentionally would go out, like when I already moved out and had my family, I would intentionally take time to spend time with him. I would go to his house for breakfast. We would go for morning walks. We would travel to Europe. We would to South Africa. We would drive to Santa Fe together. It's kind of interesting. If I rewrote this book today, one of the central concepts in the book would be scarcity. Like when you like live in the United States, and we kind of we treasure abundance, and I would argue the scarcity is this, and I can understand why, right? Because 200 years ago, all we experienced in life was scarcity, right? There was not enough food. We worked this insane hours. We lived in this ungodly conditions, etc. Today, therefore, we kind of put abundance in this kind of super aspirational things what we want. But the problem is abundance is that you usually don't value things. Like you live at, so when I realized that, when you realize you have a scarcity of time, when you realize, and that's probably one of the most scarce, that's scarce constant for everybody. We all may have different wealth, different health, but we all have the same amount of time. And therefore, I appreciate the scarcity. Made me appreciate my kids so much more, because I know that they'll grow up and they'll leave my house, and then instead of seeing when my son lived with us, now he's in college, I spend 4 or 5 hours a day with him. Now I spend 2 hours a week at the most. Okay. And so today, and this is very important, because today when I drive my daughters to school, and they are 8 and 16, especially the 16-year-old, I realize that I only have about 400 more times I'm going to drive my 16-year-old daughter to school. So that's changed my perspective, because now every time I drive her, I look at it as I look at it as a privilege, as an opportunity, not a chore. And suddenly, when I'm in the car with her, I'm not listening just to another podcast. I'm not talking on the phone to a friend, etc. I'm spending time with my girls, and I pay attention to them, and I'm mindful. I'm being present, and it's the concept of scarcity. It's this kind of realization of scarcity that brings me closer to them.
It was a great thing. And, some of the comments you make in the book about, being a parent, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because there's nothing prepares you. And, having parents yourself, obviously everybody has parents, although they may not know them, has a tremendous influence on your own relationship with your own children. And that can be a good thing, or it can be a bad thing. Obviously, for you, it's been a really, really super experience. But it's very funny, because anybody who's got children understands this, how difficult the relationship can be, and how it's the most precious thing, and how to make the most of it. And that's a great comment about the scarcity. I was talking to Herb Greenberg a couple of months ago. I was telling him that we were going to have this conversation, and he said, "Oh yeah," because Herb, obviously, I don't know how old you are, but I would guess there's 15 years between you. And Herb said, "Oh yeah, he's got a wise head. He's got my age but in a younger body," sort of thing, which I thought was a very funny and very, very true, very flattering comment.
Now, it's kind of funny. Herb read my book it wasn't quite a draft, but it was already almost a done version. And he said, when he agreed to read it, he said, when I asked him to read it, I just wanted to get his feedback. He said, "I don't know if I have time to read it, because I'm in the process of launching this new business. So I just don't know if I get to it." And then he comes back to me literally maybe less than a week. He said, "I read it almost in one sitting, and I couldn't put it down." And he said, this funny thing happened. I go around talking to my wife, and now I keep quoting your book all the time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was, and I've known Herb for a long, long time, probably for 18 years or so. And he's a phenomenal, kind, generous human being. So, so I'm kind of hearing it from him, and somebody I really greatly admire. So hearing it from him really kind of, melted my heart a little bit.
Have you sent the book to your clients?
Yeah, no, we sent it to every client. I've sent it to every client, and so far, it was a very good feedback.
Oh, good. Well, I'm sure. You wrote that COVID was a big opportunity for you to reorganize your working environment. What did you change?
At first, COVID was not a good. At first, COVID was not good for me. Not let me just put it this way. I say this, and I feel like my life was impacted the least in general, right? Because everybody at my firm can work remotely. So we didn't have to be in the office. So we had zero interruption with the business. And what I found, especially the first months of COVID, I worked from home all the time. And when I worked from home, especially all these crazy things were happening, and I had to read a lot. I had to, research new companies, try and figure out what we're going to do. And in addition to this, during COVID, especially first 2 months, I wrote, where I usually write 3 to 4 times a year to clients, I wrote once a week, because again, I had to bring them closer to the cockpit. But what happened, normally when I went to the office, I had a routine, and this routine got completely screwed up by COVID, because I was working from out of my home. I went to sleep late. I got up late because I worked long hours. I didn't, aside from writing letters to my clients, I didn't write much. So I was a complete mess. I just didn't realize it at the time. So I didn't have this self-awareness, actually, I would argue, to recognize this. And then recognize that I gained weight. I don't feel good. I'm a mess. And then what happened, I realized what happened. I completely gave up my good habits. All the habits I worked very hard to develop for years, I completely abandoned them because my routines have changed. So I actually had to rebuild my habits. So I started getting up early in the morning, walk in the park. We bought a rowing machine for home because I couldn't work out with my trainer. And I kind of rebuilt my habits. But I also realized that the way I worked in the past, when I had to go to the office, I don't have to work that way. I don't have to sit in front of, I don't, and this actually, especially, this is not quite fair to everybody because I own the firm. I can set my own schedule. But even then, if I have more flexibility than anybody else, but I was behaving as if I didn't. So today, I'll give you a couple examples. Like on Wednesdays, this is my day when I never, I don't know if you ever tried to schedule appointments with me on Wednesday. It's impossible because on Wednesday, my day is completely blacked out. I can do whatever I want. Last few months, I just on Wednesdays, I have this friend, we go to lunch, we have a 3 or 4 hour lunch and we just talk. This is me trying to be European, kind of trying to slow down time. But a lot of times I just go to the park and I sit and read in the park on Wednesdays. That is my time. That is the time that I don't owe to the family, to IMA. That is my time. Because who said that we have to work 40 hours a week, even if you do 8 hours a day? Because my day starts at 5 a.m. and I usually go home at 3. Sometimes I work on weekends, sometimes I don't. It's like investment business is not a kind of ideas per hour. And the more you work, it doesn't necessarily lead to more outcome. Because when I'm tired and I'm working, my comprehension declines a lot. And I also found that, for instance, it's also how smart you work. Like in the morning, I don't the reason you and I actually have an interview today, in the time we are having, which is 11 o'clock my time. I never do this. I rarely do this. The only reason we're doing this is because with time zone difference.
Yeah.
Normally we don't schedule a podcast interview until 1 o'clock, and there's a good reason for that because I am extremely protective with my time until 1 o'clock. I don't do phone calls with clients or anybody, so I try to work smart. When I realize if you're a morning person, you should protect the morning time. If you're an evening person, then you should protect that evening time. And so those are kind of some of the takeaways from pandemic.
Yeah, it's a bit like the Dan Pink book, When. I don't know if you've read that, where he talks about, everybody's got a natural rhythm. You're a morning person, you're an evening person, you should organize your life around that. Obviously, you've got the luxury of being able to do that. And as I do, because I'm self-employed and I can set my own times. And interestingly, I take Fridays off. So I never have any meetings on a Friday. And the one thing I do every Friday, which you'll laugh about, is I have a Zoom meeting with a friend who's got a robotics business in Eastbourne in the south coast of England, and a psychologist in Chicago. And the three of us write together on a Friday afternoon. And it sounds like a weird thing, but it's very creative because we
How do you write together?
Things.
How do you write together? Because I like the writing together to me are almost like
we discuss what we're going to do. And I often will turn up on a Friday with nothing in my head, and just listening to what they're talking about, I'll come up with an idea. And then I'll go and write, and we write, and then we write for an hour and a quarter, and then we spend 15 minutes at the end discussing each other's pieces.
Oh, I love it.
We haven't written a finished product, but we've written, maybe an email. Typically, it'll be an email to, like the emails you send out each week. I send out an email each week. And I might not have finished it all, but when somebody else reads it, they go, oh, why don't you change that word? Or that sentence doesn't make sense. And it's incredibly productive. It's a really good system.
See, that's the thing. Like, I could not do what you do. But I'm not criticizing this. I'm quite the opposite. I could not do what you do. What you do has to work for you. And I think the key to what I'm saying is you need to figure out what works for you. And so when people listen to this and watch this, and they're like, oh, Vitaliy gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning, so I should do the same thing. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you need to figure out mindfully what works for you. How, like, you analyze yourself as if you were an outsider and say, if somebody else could manage you, how could you get the most out of you? Okay. And then you find out, like, by the way, the same applies to my people at IMA. They all work differently, and they all get to choose what works for them the best. And but you need to figure out what works for you. And for you, like, the writing together works. For me, it will not work. And so what?
Well, you don't know. You've not tried it.
That's very true. Very, very true.
It's I mean, I was quite surprised, actually. But
like, for me, writing is very meditative experience, and just like this date with a computer for 2 hours a day in the darkness, like with my headphones on, listening to music. That's I kind of learned to appreciate that and to love that. Could I do this differently? Maybe, but I'm in love. Why change? Like, it's like,
oh no,
I'm in love. Why change? So but again, that's me. And I listen to classical music. Some people say there is no way I could write this classical music on. And fine, listen to different music. Don't listen to music.
We listen. Kurosh is a musician as well as being a psychologist, and he chooses the music. So we get a very wide selection, including quite a lot of classical.
That's great.
Now, you are an advocate of perpetual learning, and interestingly, the guest on my podcast this month, we're recording this in September, is Sir Clive Woodward, the manager of the England rugby team, and he is an absolute advocate of this perpetual learning. He said there isn't. I would get on a plane to anywhere to learn something. Just talk a little bit about why you believe this is so important, and how do you implement it in practice? Because you're a busy guy, right? I mean, you're getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Like, this is kind of the beauty of being an investor. Like, if you think about investing, it's really in investing. That's all you do is learn, right? That's number one. Number two, but I think it's almost like a state of mind. It's something you train yourself. I had to train myself that it's especially being a writer helped me to kind of get in the state of mind, because I always look at something as a possible story. Let me tell you the story. This is, I'm taking chess lessons because I decided that, like, we usually spend a lot of time working out our body, our muscles, right? But I realized as you get older, you also need to make sure that the most important muscle, your brain, also gets workout. And so I started taking chess lessons because, first of all, I love chess. And second of all, I realized this is probably one of the most intense mental exercises you can do. So if you presume that I'm Russian, I was born in Russia, so I should be very good at chess. Well, not really. I mean, I was born in Russia, and I was introduced to chess in a young age, but I haven't really played seriously throughout my life. I mean, I've played throughout my life, but not very seriously. Played with my kids. My kids now play chess better than I do. My daughter, my 16-year-old, kills me in chess. Now, so I decided I'm going to have a teacher. And my teacher, like in chess, the ratings are like Magnus Carlsen is rated 2,800. Okay. The chess beginner is rated 400. Okay. Like probably 99% of people in the world who play chess are rated below 1,700. Okay. So my teacher he's rated about 2,300, which is very high.
Yeah.
Okay. But here's the interesting part. He told me that he got to the level now where he stopped enjoying playing chess as much because he's not progressing. He got to the level where there's very little progress. And I realized how lucky I am. I'm coming from such a low level that for me, there is so much the area of my the area of my ignorance is so high that there's so much I can learn. And this is exactly how I look at this. So instead of me trying to say, I wish I was like him, now I'm thinking, I'm so lucky I'm not him because I get to learn. So that is the mental attitude I have towards learning. And Obviously, some subjects are more interesting to me than others, but I still try to have an open mind, even the subjects that may not appear interesting to me, because you may get surprised how things that are so mundane, there's a mental model that's buried in it that I can take from that subject and bring it to something, to something else.
Before we finish, and I should have said to you at the beginning, I didn't say, I mean, I often ask people to recommend a book, but when I've had an author on, I usually ask them to recommend their own book. But if you've got a book in mind, but before we do that, can we just touch briefly on two subjects I know are very dear to your heart? One is art and one is classical music. I mean, your father is a professional artist, is that right? And your brother is an artist.
It's kind of interesting. My father was, until he was 58 years old, a professional teacher. He was a professor at university in Russia. He has a PhD in electrical engineering, and he painted all his life because he just loved painting. When he moved to the United States, it's very difficult at 58 years old to learn English good enough to teach. So what he did, he took his hobby and turned it into profession. So until 5, 6, 7 years ago, he was selling his paintings. He doesn't do this anymore, and so that was his. That's how he earned his living. My brother is a professional realtor, but he loves to paint, and so he does it as a hobby. Yeah, and so I don't have a gift of painting, but unfortunately, I wish I did. I wish I was gifted that way, but I'm not.
Yeah, it's annoying, isn't it? Because I love art as well. And do you have a favorite museum? I mean, when you come to Europe?
It's kind of interesting. Yeah, so one of my favorite museums is actually in Zurich. They have this called Kunsthaus, I think. They just have a beautiful collection of impressionists. And I also, I love to go to every time I'm in New York, I take my kids to the Metropolitan Art Museum, and we usually go to the impressionist section, and we go to the Flemish section, and so usually, when I go to, I usually spend about 2 hours, an hour and a half at the Metropolitan Museum. So I love art, but I would argue that I love paintings less. It's all relative than classical music. So I truly, this is one of those loves that I listen to classical music every day, more than a few hours a day, and I enjoy every second of it. And I would here's the interesting point. So if I face the dilemma, if I had to give up my eyesight or my hearing, that would be very, very difficult. I would probably give up my eyesight for my hearing.
Oh, really? That's very, very interesting. I don't know if you ever read a book by a Portuguese author, whose name will escape me, but I'll put it in the show notes, called Blindness. And he envisages a society in which there's been this disease in which everybody goes blind. And there are only a few people that have eyesight. And it's the most horrific book. Jose Saragamo, I'll put it in the show notes. It's a very, very good book. You might change your mind about that. But you've also tried to instill your love for classical music in your children. And I love art, but I found it very difficult to persuade my children that they should love art. How have you done that? You just take them to museums in the case of art, or show them stuff. But in the case of classical music, you can have it playing all the time. Is it easier to do that?
That's a good question. So with art, I think I had a secret weapon, which is my father. My kids adore my father, and and therefore, we would go to Santa Fe, and we go to Santa Fe every year. And my father, and in Santa Fe, they have this street called Canyon Road, and imagine a sleepy neighborhood, where they take every house that used to be a house and now convert it into a gallery. There's, I don't know, a few hundred galleries, and we would go in the morning, 9 or 10 in the morning, and walk down the street going from gallery to gallery. And my father would tell my kids about, discuss with them paintings. And I tell you this, that is such a special time for my kids, because the grandpa, who they respect tremendously and love dearly, shares with them. They'll kind of makes them see art differently. And now, even when we travel without my father, and we would go to an art museum, like we would go to New City, and for us, going to an art museum is just something we do. It's like not something we discuss, something we just do. And you would argue that like this is like, but it's always followed by something like what considered to be universally fun. We go to get sushi, we go to Dairy Queen, or do something that's considered to be universally fun for younger generation. And that's how I always mix that. So like when we go to classical music concert, and after that we're gonna go out for burgers, or before that, or something like that. So it's a mixture of like, and by the way, my parents did the same thing when I was little. They would take me to classical music concerts, and in the intermission, they would buy me some sweets.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I'm sure I'm making my dentist very happy. But this is how I kind of get my kids to, so it's very, you can't force anybody to love anything.
No.
But what you can do, you can kind of introduce it to them. Okay. And so in classical music, I would argue, is especially classical music, it's a very complex medium, which has a lot of layers. So when you listen to it for the first time, you usually get the top layer, and the top layer, a lot of times, it doesn't have the beauty. The beauty is actually 5 layers lower. But for you to hear the beauty, you need to hear it, half a dozen times. So by me playing this music on the background very often, my kids get to kind of get through those layers little by little.
And is there a book you recommend to someone thinking of becoming an investor? You've written 2 yourself. That would be.
Yeah, no, I'm not gonna recommend my books. I've did plenty of this during the show already. Let me see some good books. Oh, you know what? Actually, yes. William Green just did a wonderful book, Richer, Wiser, Happier. I would, and I think that's a terrific book, and I highly recommend it.
No, that's a great recommendation.
The one book I really enjoyed, by Rolf Dabelli, actually, the Art of the Good Life. The Art of the Good Life. I thought it was a terrific book, because what it does, it has 52 little chapters, and they all just like, it's kind of like, in the hindsight, I didn't realize it when I wrote my book, but it's a kind of similar. This has a lot of short chapters, and you can read one chapter at a time, and it's self-contained. And his book is kind of like that as well. So the Art of the Good Life.
Funnily enough, I've got that on my nightstand, and I've been reading it for quite a while, just picking up, and because it is that nice thing that you can just pick it up just when you want to read just one chapter. So that's great. And tell me, you've got a website with your writing, a website on classical music. Could you just tell the listeners where they can find?
Sure. So I'll give you several websites. Number one, if you want to learn about classical music, if you just want to get a curated list of classical music, go to myfavoriteclassical.com. Steve, what happens is that after I wrote the book, I couldn't stop writing, and I keep writing. So since the book came out, I already wrote 5 new chapters, and I'm working on the 6th one. So you can get those chapters absolutely free once you buy the book. If you go to soulinthegame.net, soulinthegame.net. And you can also subscribe to my articles from that website. So you can get my articles where I talk about life, classical music, investing, different topics. And finally, we have a podcast. And the podcast is basically my articles read to you. I'm not, I don't interview guests, etc. I don't do anything specifically for it. My articles read to you, luckily not by me. And it's called The Intellectual Investor podcast. You can find it anywhere you can listen to podcasts, or you just go investor.fm. That's it.
That's brilliant. Listen, thank you so much for doing this. It's been really a pleasure. It's been so much fun reading the book, and so much fun talking to you. I'm looking forward to your coming back to London and taking advantage of as we're recording this, the pound rate is about 107. Or if you're a PayPal user trying to transfer dollars into sterling, 116. Thanks, PayPal. So you really need to come over. And, London is so enjoyable at $1.07 for American.
Like as you and I talked to, like when I was in London, 1997, I think the pound was at 2. So at the time I was just started my career, and it was a lot of money. Like so, we would go to McDonald's and everything seemed like, if you convert to US dollars, seemed like twice as expensive. So I had to imagine that it wasn't really the prices were not in pounds but in US dollars. So now I don't have to. My imagination does not have to be as rich as it was then.
You're laughing. I mean, I had the reverse experience. We were in restaurants in the States. So I was in America in August. And we're restaurants in the States, and the price is in pounds, because by the time you've added 20% service, it was 120 when I was there, and so it was just in pounds, and it was quite frightening. There was one thing I just want to ask you about before we go, because in the book you keep explaining that you're having terrible experiences with rental cars. You say when you go to the rental car desk and you don't get an upgrade. Have you had like a really bad experience? Because I've had a really bad experience with Hertz, where I've been a massive customer for many, many years, and I got ripped off when I was renting a car and returned it early, and they charged me twice the price. And I wrote to the Hertz people. I mean, absolutely impossible. I eventually ended up writing to the CEO in America, and they offered me a voucher which was like a third of what it cost me. And I thought, oh, but have you had the same? Was it Hertz? Tell me it was Hertz that you had the same.
I'll be honest. I had a rental car experience with almost probably every rental car company there is, and the thing is, it's really what I learned from that is that it's really up to me to interpret it as a bad experience or as a learning experience. So today I put it proudly in kind of a learning experience. But in the book I had to use something. I had to come back to something. So that was my go-to, because that's probably the most universal bad character. When we have bad experiences, most can relate to it. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being on, and I'm looking forward for us meeting up in London.
Absolutely, Steve. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
I don't think Vitaliy does anything without thinking really carefully about it. His life philosophy, the idea that time is scarce, is a really powerful idea, and his habit of framing things in a positive light is an approach we can all learn from. I hope you enjoyed it and took something from it. If you enjoyed this, you'll be pleased to hear we have more episodes planned. Subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss them. Thanks as ever for listening and for your support.